Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for July 7th, 2021. I'm going to continue the theme I was developing yesterday on the debacle in Afghanistan and taking a look at this in contrast to the potential for cooperation to deal with these kinds of problems in the future. The line from the Geopoliticians now is that the U.S. needs to disengage from the Middle East, from Southwest Asia. Why? Because it was such a bad policy? Which it was. No, because we have to engage in the Indo-Pacific. So we're moving the theater of geopolitical military confrontation from the one traditional British stomping ground, Southwest Asia, into another, the Indo-Pacific. Now, the argument is that leaving Afghanistan frees the U.S. to concentrate on the Indo-Pacific. This was the same line that Obama had with the so-called pivot to Asia, that you draw down troops in Afghanistan, it gives you more manpower, more money, and so on. Well, what's the point? To expend lives and money in another endless war? The U.S., meanwhile, is going to continue some form of counter-terror operations in Afghanistan from bases probably in Qatar or the United Arab Emirates. Now, they're going to need an aircraft carrier for deployment by air operations. So the U.S. Ronald Reagan, or the USS Ronald Reagan, is leaving the South China Sea to go to waters off Pakistan. There are questions also, will Turkey cooperate? Do we really want to have Turkey bringing in their forces from Syria into Afghanistan? And there's another problem for Biden, which is that polls show that the American people are more concerned with countering terrorism than they are with combating the rise of China. So when you look at this, we're shifting one geopolitical battleground for another. This is not getting out of the umbrella of geopolitics or out from the straitjacket of geopolitics, but into another, probably more dangerous realm, which threatens more lives and implies the possibility that we'll end up in a nuclear war. Now, in contrast to this, there was a three-way video conference yesterday between French President Macron, German Chancellor Merkel, and China's President Xi Jinping. And so while the British are pushing the United States toward more confrontation with Russia and China, we're seeing a counter tendency, maybe small at present, but nevertheless real, coming from Germany and France. They're taking steps to break out from under this umbrella of geopolitics. Among the things they decided was to support the return to the European Union-China Investment Agreement. This is something that was signed not that long ago, and then there was a decision made to reject it. But the French and the Germans are saying we need it. It's the direction of the future. China is one of the leading trade partners of Europe, if not the leading trade partner. And if you break that relationship, what's going to happen? Xi Jinping, in his part of the discussion, called for mutual respect and cooperation and holding a European Union-China summit as soon as possible. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was interviewed on China Plus, an English language radio station from China. She called the discussion constructive and much needed. And she contrasted the outlook of Merkel and Macron to the bitterness from one of the participants of the European Union, the foreign minister of Lithuania, who called for an end of French-German dominance of the European Union because he's pushing for a hard line against China, as he is for a hard line against Russia. Remember, Merkel recently said, and Macron joined her, saying that there should be more conversations with Putin instead of just sanctions and acrimony. And they were roundly denounced by the NATO leadership. Now, going back to the Macron-Merkel-Xi discussion, Xi called for cooperation, among other things, in Africa, including in combating the COVID crisis. Now, at the same time, the Chinese had a conference of world political parties, which included representatives from 160 nations. It included a number of heads of state, particularly from African countries. And Xi Jinping laid out a proposal which included the following points. Development is the right of all countries. And he called for cooperation of the large developed countries to participate in improving the circumstances for the developing sectors, ending the years of colonialism. He also said all countries are free to choose their own path. That is, that the rules-based order is not a one-size-fits-all. The rules-based order was designed by the Davos billionaires and the central bankers operating on behalf of the too-big-to-fail banks to establish a global bankers' dictatorship, to allow the flow of funds and resources into the speculative bubble held by the so-called too-big-to-fail banks, to be enforced by what? U.S. military power. Now, this is the fight going on in the world today. Whether the United States will remain in the straitjacket of the rules-based order, an arbitrary system which is unilateral and which takes the interests of the Western banks as primary and insists that we have a great reset which gives dictatorial power to those central banks to determine spending policy, fiscal policy in the so-called democracies of the advanced sector. How is that democracy when you have technocrats operating on behalf of the central banks who are operating on behalf of the private interests of the private banks? How is that democracy to have them dictate the economic policies of nations? This is going to be the big fight in the United States. Will we continue to carry out provocative geopolitical confrontations with Russia, China, and other countries such as Venezuela, Iran, and so on, for the purposes of defending a speculative bubble which is unsustainable under any circumstances? And to protect it, we're heading into a realm of hyperinflation, which will steal the savings and the life work of most of the middle class of the United States and Western Europe. That's what is being pushed by the conferences, the summits of the Group of Seven and NATO, a military alliance that's also a political alliance worldwide to enforce the policies demanded by the bankers against the needs and interests of the vast majority of the human race, including in the United States. Do you wish to be taxed again for another never-ending war, this time in the Indo-Pacific, while you're still going to be taxed to continue the wars that are going on in Southwest Asia? Instead, the proposal from Mrs. LaRouche is to extend the Belt and Road Initiative into Afghanistan, to give them a chance to have to participate in the economic development miracle which has taken place in China, and extend it further into Iraq and Syria. But the U.S. is continuing to support the Caesar sanctions, which say that any country or company that tries to reconstruct Syria, as long as Assad is there as president, will be sanctioned. In other words, no reconstruction. After we, the NSA and the CIA and the MI6 and NATO countries and the U.S. military destroyed those countries, Iraq in particular and Syria, killed in Syria 500,000 people died in the civil war. A civil war which was funded by American taxpayers, in which we provided arms and training to the most vicious and brutal barbarians of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra variety. To do what? To have a regime change in Syria. That's not the tradition of the United States. So the question is posed, and this is what I'm posing to you again. Will the U.S. continue to be the enforcer of the central bank's rules-based dictatorship? will the American people continue to have imposed on them the bailout of those of the shadow banking system and the cost of policing under a British geopolitical direction, the unilateral world order of the Davos billionaires and the private too-big-to-fail banks? If you don't support that, join the Schiller Institute. Join with us to defeat this phony rules-based order, which is being imposed with your money, with your work, and against your own interests. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow.